All right. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with my friend Adam Clark. We're going to talk about Black theology today. He had a lecture everyone got to enjoy, along with some readings. It's part of the Many Faces of Christ class, and we got 30 some very excellent questions sent in. So
Yes.
we'll we'll see how many of them we get to. Um, I'm optimistic. I've been getting better at uh, just reading questions and not adding on a 3 minute aside along with each one.
They were good. They were actually pretty thoughtful. I was pleasantly surprised.
Well, yeah, I we had some great listeners and readers, and so what we're gonna do, we're gonna be digging into this. If you are listening or watching, and haven't got to enjoy the lecture, want to check out the reading, then go to manyfacesofchrist.com where you can sign up and get his lecture along with a bunch of others, including next week's where I do process Christology, and and yeah, then you can send in questions and harass me next week. That we'll see how that goes. Um, but all right, so Adam, one question before we get going, and I noticed this in a couple of them that there are people in this class that haven't taken one of the classes where we spent the whole time looking at the Black theology or the legacy of James Cone. And so there are a couple different ones about your vocation. So maybe you could say a bit about your own kind of academic and faith narrative that set you up to be a student of James Cone, and how you discovered the Black theological tradition and such.
Yeah, thank you for that, Trip. I actually grew up Episcopalian, similar to Kelly Brown Douglas, except for she grew up in a Black Episcopal church. I grew up in an integrated Episcopal church. When I went to college, my mentors were mostly Black Baptist preachers. So I was introduced to historical criticism. I was introduced to Clarence Jordan, the Cotton Patch Bible. I was
Yeah.
introduced to Howard Thurman. So in college, I got introduced, and actually liberation theology and Black theology also, because there were some Cone students who were teaching at my undergraduate institution. So a lot of the questions that I was an acolyte. I participated in church. When I say that, it's different from a lot of evangelicals because at a kind of Eastern liberal Anglican church, participation isn't the same, as uh, as as if you were at a Southern evangelical church. And what I mean by that is that my church, like, it was, I didn't understand it at the time, but they rented the church out for um, same-sex gatherings to happen on Wednesday and that type of thing, which was at the time very controversial, but I didn't know anything about it till I became an adult. And our church was marked for being, excessively liberal. So I'll say that. But a lot of my existential questions weren't answered by the church. And when I asked, and I also had another, I guess, important note is that I had a woman priest as a teenager. And at the time, I thought that was normal. And it wasn't like at the seminary when people said, oh, that's a very abnormal thing. Like women can't be ministers in this denomination, that denomination. And I had no idea because to me, it was normal. It was natural. And I didn't even understand that women had a tough time in ministry because it was never discussed. And my model for ministry was a woman priest,
Yeah.
right? So I'll put that to there. But in terms of Black theology, I was introduced to it in the university, in college, and they started answering more of my existential questions that were not responded to in my integrated Anglican church. So that type of, so I had the kind of religious questions from an undergrad, and I had effective answers I had the questions for religious meaning as a high schooler. I had some responses that were effective as an undergrad, and I pursued that through graduate school, where I went to Colgate Rochester Divinity School, which is the home of both Martin Luther King Jr. and Howard Thurman, and that formation led me to Cone.
Yeah. In the lecture, you're both like kind of introducing Black Christology by looking at a number of figures historically. But at the beginning, you were kind of framing this tradition in light of our contemporary context. And one of the contrasts you drew, Marcus has a question for, and he said, "How does viewing theology as resistance rather than reflection change our approach to contemporary issues of faith and justice?"
Yeah, that's been, part of what the liberationist tradition has always done, right? Um, they don't want theology to be passive contemplation. Theology should be active confrontation. One way of trying to say it that the goal of theology is not just to interpret the world, is to transform it. So part of that transformation starts with resistance. So that's what I was really trying to get at, that this is the moment where just if theology is talk about talk about talk, right, it's not going to do a whole lot of good. That talk has to be something that tries to produce some type of effect, transformative effect on the world. And so it's thought and action. It's orthopraxis. It's thought with the aim or the interest of trying to inspire liberatory or right action.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, at the beginning you kind of talked about the challenge of Christian nationalism in the present, and David asked, "What specific elements of current Christian nationalism do you see as most threatening to authentic Christian witness?"
Oh gosh, really? All of it? No. Well, Christian nationalism, when you get the machinery of the state and how it's being used to silence dissent, to defund critical thought, to target racialize others, right? It gives a certain type of religious rhetoric to a political project that allies more with empire than it does with the gospel. So that, the number one critique of Christian nationalism, that it really bears false witness to what the gospel is actually about. So its value system is more aligned with the seizure of power or the lust for mammon than it is with solidarity with the oppressed.
Hmm. Yeah. Sarah asked, "How does the concept of co-option differ from unbelief as a threat to Christianity, and why might it be more dangerous?"
Yeah.
You can say a bit about how Christianity gets co-opted first, and that kind of unbelief or the non-Christian, non-person kind of dynamic that you brought up.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what evangelical history has been about like faith versus the unbeliever, right? And what happens when you have marginalized community, the problematic isn't unbelief, it's non-personhood, it's dehumanization. So that it's faith against the dehumanized, right? Be, um, that when Jesus looked to heal people, he didn't ask for their religious affiliation before he healed, right? Like it was about you are hurting. So it's much more about the humanity of the person. So that the whole of faith should be about um, how we understand bringing people from the dehumanized or the human violation to the new humanity or the new creation. And that's what the Liberationist Project brought into academic theology, is this idea that the very framework, even the Christological question, right? Like, which I didn't actually say in the actual lecture, but the Christological question for Black theology is different as well. Generally, the Christological question is about the relationship between Jesus' divinity and Jesus' humanity and trying to play with that. Um, in liberation theology, it's much more about Christian faith and injustice, right? Like it's the Christological question is how do you make it's about the problematic isn't the type of Chalcedon unity of being fully human and fully divine. It's about the credibility of faith itself.
Yeah.
right? That's what's at stake. So I think we're more in a time when the credibility of faith is at stake than we're talking about certain type of Greek metaphysics of how we linked humanity and divinity. And that's where the problematic lies in Black theology and most liberation theologies.
Yeah. 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 I mean, it's one thing to spill some ink, making sure you keep Jesus human, another to defend the humanity of millions of people.
Right, right. I don't, we you talk to check out of everyday people, they're not entertaining that type of question because we live in a totally different metaphysical world, metaphysical universe. And what people are asking is this real? Is this credible? Is it authentic? Can I rely on it? And and the problem becomes if it's not real, if it's not just, if I can't rely on it, then I'm not going to actually invest myself into it. And that's the problematic that has been working with Black communities. And I think just most communities today is that when I'm even working with young people, they want to know, is this a credible faith to invest my life into?
Yeah. So in the lecture, you kind of looked at a number of different figures and started the story by looking at Howard Thurman. And Thomas has a question in relationship to Thurman and the reading from Jesus and the Disinherited we had. He asked, "What's the significance of comparing Jesus' situation to that of American Black people?"
Yeah, that was, in Thurman started to do that after he was questioned about it, right? And just to kind of summarize the story that I recount, he recounts this in Jesus and the Disinherited, which is a book that I think was published in 49. And he's in India, and someone comes up to him and they say, "Look, why are you here?" He's one of the first. He was the first Black American delegation to actually take a trip under Christian identity or a Christian organization to India. So he's Black, he's representing Christianity, he's in India. India is a Hindu nation. So another Hindu professional comes up to him and says, "Why are you here?" And think about it. Hindus under colonialism at the time, the British colonialism. So Hinduism is part of the colonial matrix of power. And he's looking at these Black Americans as extensions of that power. And Thurman's like, no, I'm not like that. Matter of fact, what I didn't say, which actually is part of the backstory, is that he almost declined to go to India because he didn't want to soft pedal American racism and act like everything was okay. But he had to be convinced that the opportunity to meet Mahatma Gandhi was greater than his reservations about kind of American Christianity. So his idea is, I'm going to meet Gandhi. I'm not going to turn this down. But he had internal contradictions. So what happened when he was pressed on the issue, and the Hindu, I think it was a law professor, put it sharply and said, "Look, I think you're a traitor to your race because this tradition has led to lynching, slavery, apartheid for you and other darker peoples of the world." He had to rethink, what his relationship to Christian faith was. And what he found out, or what he started to think about, is that what never occurred to him in his thinking about Christian faith, which was, first, Jesus was, quote unquote, a minority within Roman Empire. And he said, well, we're minorities too. Jesus was a Jew, a Jewish minority, and he was an undocumented Jew, meaning that he wasn't a citizenship. So therefore, Black people aren't citizens of America. This is 1949. This is 1936, actually, when he's there, right? So he says Black people aren't full citizens either. And then he says that Jesus grew up in an atmosphere of strife and violence. Well, I'm in the American South where there's lynchings. So he's seeing these structural parallels between the historical Jesus and the life of Black people specifically in the American South. He was born in Florida. And he starts to rethink the Christian project from that standpoint, is one of the earliest kind of prototypes of what would later become Black theology. But he sees like what we refer to as structural parallels between Jesus as a Jew within Roman Empire and Black people in America under American Empire.
Yeah. Yeah. Lisa asked a question kind of in the way, in the longer one, she said she had heard people reference Thurman before, but had not heard someone talk about the role his deep contemplative life played, along with his kind of social activism and the vision of the faith he describes in Jesus and the Disinherited. And she said, according to Thurman, what were the primary survival strategies or alternatives faced by the Jewish minority in Palestine under Roman rule, and how does he describe Jesus offering a different path? Like she was really enjoying the fruit that's possible once you start to make those comparisons, and what it means for possibilities for life today.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that is that, well, first, just a bit of background. His text that later became Jesus and the Disinherited, he first wanted to label the hounds of hell. And this is where you need a good editor. The editor said, I don't know if that will sell too well. So the publisher, actually, the marketer, said, no, I think Jesus and the Disinherited would fit this well. But what he meant by the hounds of hell, and if you ever get a chance to read the text, the hounds of hell is what we would probably refer to as sin, right? So that for him is fear, deception, and hatred. And those are the chapters of the book. It's fear, deception, hatred, and then love, right? So what he says is that in the life of the oppressed, these issues of fear, right? Like in terms of that's one of the deepest things in terms of, if you think of the civil rights movement, it's the fear of confronting the people who hate you, right? You're talking to a minority population who does not have weapons, who do not have rights, who are going against a people who have guns, who have law, and have power on their side, right? And financial power as well, right? So he says fear is a debilitating thing. And he goes on, he talks about different types of fear, and he goes into nature and talks about fear. And he says, the first thing we have to overcome fear. Then he says deception, right? He says the dangerous thing about about deceiving is about you could become the deception. So his thing was, this is pretty radical act, is that never lie. Like even if the slave master comes and asks you like, where did someone run away? It's like you were under moral obligation to tell the truth at all times, right? You can maybe misdirect, but you can't intentionally lie. So for him, deception, and he goes into nature and he talks about the cuttlefish and how they deceive the predators in the deep blue sea and that type of thing. And then he talks about hatred, how hatred kills the host. So he first roots out all of these things that are obstacles. And what he wants to really say at the end of his analysis about this is that in order for the oppressor to win a permanent victory against the oppressed, they must win a victory in the spirit of the marginalized, right? So how do you counteract that? Well, the love ethic for him. And the love ethic for him was key. And this is actually, Thurman was a teacher of King, right? And there's a whole kind of Black social gospel tradition that centralizes the love of Jesus, the love ethic of Jesus. And Thurman is one of the most important moral exemplars of what the love ethic is, especially in the early 20th century and even up to the mid 20th century. And for him, that the love ethic is what counters, is the antidote. And he uses that to try to talk about buttressing the spirit of the oppressed. So that being a loving, and what he meant by love was not sentiment. He meant by love is that coming from one center, that honor, love was a species of the good. It was something that talks about one's personal integrity and for someone to come from their own centeredness and not just be reactionary to their oppressor or their political enemy. So for him, the idea is to win a victory, um, um, to make the enemy into a friend, like what King would say, than to try to conquer your enemies, right? To witness to the truth.
Yeah. Yeah, so that kind of picks up right where Anthony's question, where he asks, how does Thurman's concepts of the hounds of hell, fear, deception, and hatred, relate to contemporary struggles for justice? Or and maybe you can talk about how, maybe even in your own experience, I know how Thurman has played a role in kind of bringing the contemplative and justice threads of the Black theological tradition into the present.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thurman doesn't play enough of a role, right? Like most people, most Americans we live in such a hyper consumeristic world and kind of moral ecology now that most people don't pay attention to the cultivation of the spirit. Most people are just looking at when they say justice, and even the idea of justice has changed, right? Like justice means, and I'll back up a little bit. For Cone and a lot of liberation theologians, justice meant a whole alternative system, right? When you look at most contemporary leaders, justice means inclusion into the system, right? Like when you look at the difference between maybe a Malcolm and a Martin, and let's say a Jesse Jackson and a Sharpton, like Jesse and Sharpton are fighting for inclusion, which is not a bad thing, but it's not the identical thing as liberation in terms of trying to create a whole new structure, right? So the people that were martyred, usually we're talking about a more fundamental dimension of social change, where the people who live into their 80s, and I'm not being critical, I'm just being descriptive of this, is saying they were fighting for more representation from Black and marginalized communities into the system, right? So I would say that the idea of contemplative work to cultivate the soul is a minority report within social justice movement, and is not really is not really a constitutive part of the leadership class. But that's why we have these type of conversations about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the big contrasts that is in Jesus and the Disinherited is when Rachel here has a question about what's at stake in Thurman's distinction between the religion of Jesus versus the religion about Jesus. And she went on to say she grew up in a multi-ethnic church, but never heard the distinction. But it was really helpful because when in college and she went to a Christian campus group, uh, it was she didn't really know what was going on. It just seemed so weird, and it was a just religion about Jesus church group,
Yeah.
and so anyway, there was a long little personal note along it, but she was kind of interested in that distinction.
Yeah. For Thurman, Albert Cleage uses a similar type of language. And I think that actually goes back to Harnack. I'm not sure, but that what he meant by that was that the religion about Jesus is all the things that people say about Jesus. It's how the tradition developed pretty much post Constantine. So it aligns with empire, it aligns with conquest. So all the things that makes Christianity compatible with slavery, with genocide, with apartheid, that's about Jesus. The religion of Jesus for Thurman was about how do I have a similar experience of God as Jesus had, right? I want to have that type of powerful, because for him, what was central in Christianity was the religious experience, right? Like his idea of interracial and interfaith worship was centering and anchored on having a common experience of God at the center of the liturgy. So for him, the religion of Jesus was trying to aspire or create the conditions for that to happen. And that would be the primary distinction.
Yeah. Okay. Maria sent a question. I had to make a short version of it, but it was based on the reading. She said Thurman suggests interpreting Jesus as religious subject rather than religious object. What does
Mm.
this distinction imply, and why is it significant for his understanding of Jesus? In it, she said, "Is this related to the argument in church history of whether you begin with the person of Jesus or the work of Jesus? Is it similar to the debate in liberal Christology of starting with Jesus' religious consciousness or the encounter with the gospel?" She goes, "It seems like it's one of those distinctions. It's really important, but I couldn't quite piece it
Wow.
together compared to the others."
That's a very insightful question.
I
I'll
know.
say I'll say it by a realm of story. When Thurman was a young person, I think it was 13 years old. His father died, and he's in the South. He's in Daytona Beach, and they're trying to call the father. They're trying to like have his father buried by a preacher, but since he died outside the church, they couldn't find a local preacher that was willing to do his funeral. Right, so they're panicking and they're scared. They're like, "Man, I can't give a proper burial to my father." So they finally get an itinerant preacher who comes, and they're relieved. The family's like, "Finally, we have someone who can actually preach my father's funeral." So he's sitting at his funeral, and he hears the preacher preaching and doing the eulogy, and and then he realized that the preacher is preaching his father to hell, and he's traumatized by this. He's 13 years old, and he vows to himself, "I'll never have anything to do with this religion again." Right? He goes on to say that even though I had animosity toward institutional religion, I had a relationship with Jesus. And his relationship with Jesus, he said we would talk for hours and hours. And he talked about Jesus as friend, right? It would be like actually a dialogue and conversation partner. And Thurman had a lot of kind of very mystic things, like he would talk to trees and talk to nature. And Jesus was part of like his conversation partner in his head for a long time. So when he talks about um, his spirituality emerge from Jesus as subject, meaning that Jesus as a dialogue partner, Jesus as a friend, and not Jesus as an object of worship, right? Like for him, the idea of looking at Jesus as an object to be worshiped was a principle of division, not a principle of unity. So even though he had a Christology, he was much more theocentric in his theology, meaning that Jesus was a way of talking about God, what God's expectations are of us, how we should act in light of God. It wasn't Jesus in and of itself split off from a universal divine presence, right? It was always the way God is acting in Jesus in that way. So he stressed much more the humanity of Jesus than the divinity of Jesus. And he would say it like this way. He said, look, when Jesus was on the mountain and the devil tempted him to jump, he's that you could have a whole bunch of angels come and save you on the way down. Thurman was like, I think if Jesus would have jumped, he probably would have died, right? And if he wouldn't have died, then that's a mockery of our humanity, because he wouldn't have been fully human if that's the case. So for him, and this is what actually attracted me as a younger person, like listening to lectures on Howard Thurman, is because it was that his idea of being Christian was to take the full humanity of Jesus seriously, and you didn't have to be. It wasn't contingent on supernatural acts or miracles of faith in order to walk a Christian path. And that to me was comforting. It wasn't strange.
Mm-hmm. So we had some questions about Albert Cleage's work from the lecture and reading and such, and he might be the one people are least familiar with. So if you need to give any more background than normal, you feel free. Robert and it had a longer email, but one of the questions in it was, what are the theological implications of Cleage's argument that Jesus would have ridden in the colored section of segregated buses?
Yeah.
And maybe help us understand that element in his thought historically existing between Thurman's work and Cohn's.
Yeah, that's a good question, and we're struggling with this. That question is really about the blackness of Jesus. He believed the historical Jesus was black, right? So what does black mean, right? We're going through that with the Pope right now, right? They see elements of Haitian and Creole in him, and in the American context under British rule, blackness was defined as one drop of black blood, right? So that was the rule. That's the standard rule. And I think it still is the standard rule that that's how we define blackness in the context of the United States. Now, I want to preface this by saying two things. One is that the Bible is pre-racialization, right? So we're talking a little bit anachronistically. And two, that's not the only the Spanish had a different definition of black, right? They have all this like mulatto and morena, like they have all these different types of mixture. They might have different stratifications of black. So we're talking about the United States here, because in Brazil you have different gradations of this. So this idea is very arbitrary. It's humanly constructed. But if we're going to play in this sandbox of the United States, then we're not going to change the rules. So to talk about Jesus as the Black Messiah, as Albert Cleage does, doesn't mean he was phenotypically looked like African Americans per se. It means one drop, which also means, not here, but like Pope Leo the 14th, you could be 99% white, right? But in the context of the American South, you would be seen as impure, right? Because you have African in your lineage. And that's a strange concept. It's not really like a fair, but those are the rules in terms of American chattel slavery. So I use that example. That's actually not his example he put to the text. That's my example to try to translate that to people, is that when people talk about the blackness of Jesus, the blackness of the nation of Israel, or the blackness of any historical biblical character, we're talking about by United States rules to try to translate that into this type of interpretive context, and saying that, yeah, when we say black, we're saying that they would be on the back of the bus, that they wouldn't pass the racial miscegenation laws or the racial purity laws that this country was built upon.
Yeah. So thinking of Cleage, then Michael asks, what's the significance of Cleage's rejection of individual salvation in favor of collective liberation? And in the longer thing, he talked about how that played out in Black church life at that time, because in versus maybe how it plays out in the present.
Yeah, well, for Cleage, this is a bit funny, but this goes to the difference for him between Paul and Jesus. That Jesus was the Black Messiah who's liberating a Black nation of Israel, who has this nation-centered project, right? The idea of Messiah is a Jewish term, which means deliverer. So he's trying to deliver the nation of Israel from Roman oppression, right? Now, the Apostle Paul is where the corruption goes wrong for him. That he takes this type of collective religion and then talks about not the Black Messiah, or not Messiah, but Christ. They change the title to Christ, which is a Greco-Roman, which means anointed one, that spiritualizes and depoliticizes Jesus and makes compromises with the Roman government, right, in a way that Jesus didn't. Paul is a citizen of Rome. Jesus is not a citizen of Rome, right? And he makes and he makes the representation from fish to a symbol of the cross, right, which is a pagan symbol, he says, a pagan Roman symbol. And he individualizes faith so that now it's not about the collectivity, it's about the individual. So Jesus died for my sins, or Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. All that's from Paul, right? All the pro-slavery passages are from Paul, they're not from Jesus. So for him, that Paul becomes a great enemy of the religion of Jesus from Cleage's interpretation.
Yeah. So Kevin asked how you would contrast James Cone's understanding of blackness as a theological category from Cleage's more literal interpretation.
Yeah, well, they're talking to two different audiences. Cone is talking to an academic audience, and he realizes that a lot of what Cleage says, and Cleage is talking to just regular, everyday type of really black activists, not even just black lay folk, but he's talking to, in the context of the 40s and 50s, blacks who are socialists, who are NAACP people. He's talking to Black Lives Matter people. He's talking to folks like that, right? And those folks are fed up with Christianity because they're always taking the wrong side. The institutional church is always taking the wrong side on racial justice issues in urban areas, right? When he's actually most active. So he's trying to offer an interpretation of Christian faith that has relevance for their lives. So Jesus becomes a revolutionary in the way they want revolution, right? That's Cleage. Cone has a very, very different project, although similar type of language and similar influences of the Black Power movement. And he says, look, I can't prove the blackness of the historical Jesus, but we do know that Jesus is non-white. So for him, his conversation about Black Christ is about solidarity with the oppressed. He doesn't want to talk about the phenotype of Jesus. He's kind of almost agnostic on that. He says, what's important about the gospel is about God's incarnation into oppressed humanity. And in the context of North America, that's symbolically or by analogy Black, right? He says, in India, that might be the Dali. In Korea, it might be something else. It doesn't mean that's Black every place. So he's one of the earliest people to have a self-consciously contextual theology. He says, I'm talking about Black theology is really trying to express what the gospel means in the context of North American Christianity. Right? Where Cleage is trying to talk about, I don't care where you are, Jesus is historically Black, right? Like, so it's a very different thing. So it's really, there's two, Aquinas talks about the analogy of being, Barth talks about the analogy of faith. Cone kind of uses that, like almost what David Tracy talks about, the analogical imagination, meaning that you realize that human words are limited and can never exhaust who and what God is. So the best we could do is try to approximate that. So for him, he was self-conscious, and he's a trained theologian where Cleage is a pastor. He's self-conscious about the limits of trying to do this. But he's saying, I think the best application of trying to talk about the gospel in 20th century America is to talk about this is a Black Christ who is active and marginalized in the movements of the oppressed, right? So that's the way he's using it, where Cleage is trying to talk about phenotype, Cone is talking about solidarity.
Yeah. Okay. There are two questions that are about kind of Cone's theological project and how he's wrestling with the nature of revelation stuff. And I think maybe I'll just read them both, and then you can say whatever you want, since you and one is kind of in reference to something previous in the class. Sam said, Reuben in the Reformed session mentioned Cone being a kind of Bardian. And Reuben being also having James Cone for as a professor. How does he see the divine revelation in Christ and its relationship to historical Jesus research often employed by other liberation theologians? And a lot of liberation theologians will do kind of Christology from below, historical Jesus, and then kind of build out, versus the kind of Christology from above, revelational priority of Barth. And so he asked that question, and here's another one that is very similar. Deborah said, Cone speaks of a dialectical relationship between the believer's social context, scripture, and tradition. How do those elements interact and inform an understanding of Jesus today? And so, both of them are trying to kind of get the methodological framing of what Cone's up to.
Yeah. I would say just a matter of, just to make a point. Some of the claims about Cole's Bartianism are a bit overstated. I mean, he uses the language of neo-orthodoxy in his early writings, but he breaks from that because that for him was a way of trying to talk about Christian identity. And he reads the Black experience in almost like a Christoform, meaning that it kind of talks about the suffering and resurrections of Jesus kind of mirror or parallel the sufferings and rise of Black people in the United States for him, right? Like Black people came into the United States under like the crucifixion of slavery, and then they rise out of slavery, and then they become crucified again, and they rise. So for him, the liberation movements are the resurrecting of a people who have been crucified, right? So you have different historical moments. So he's rereading Black experience through that. He uses that as a way of trying to talk about using systematic categories. He doesn't do that in his later work. But what he's trying to do is he has all this type of, academic theology in his head, and he's trying to say, how do I relate this to the Black experience where my colleagues could take this seriously? Cone's earliest books, which were not written for the academy, they were written for the movement, that was Black Theology and Black Power and Black Liberation Theology, weren't even labeled as theology when they first came out. They were labeled as either Black studies or sociology. It wasn't until God of the Oppressed, which is the assigned reading that I did, that I gave, that his academic peers said, oh, this is what you're talking about. Because for many academic theologians, his earlier work weren't even legible. I mean, because it was written in a Black idiom. And they couldn't even understand that as being theology. So he used those categories as a way of trying to say, and he's at Union at the time. Before, he was at these smaller colleges. So when he gets to Union, he's around, and Union at the time is the school of Reinhold Niebuhr, the school of Paul Tillich, and those towering legacies are over him. And he's a junior professor with all of these theological giants, and he has to try to make sense and try to have them respect what he's saying, right? So that was a book that he uses these categories to make other academic theologians respect what he's saying. So he's using this type of academic methodology. But for him, that was more instrumental than foundational. What's foundational for him is just the dialogue between Black experience and Christian tradition, right? That's the main dialogue, I would just say. So how do you translate the meaning of Christian faith through the medium of the Black experience in America, right? I think that's a simpler way of trying to understand his project. And what he's seeing there is that Christianity is being translated to comfort the powerful. And that when we look at Jesus did not die of natural causes. Jesus was executed. So how do you have an executed deity at the center of your thought, yet the implications of what's happening in church are always to go to the powerful, right? So he wanted to try to translate the threat. Kierkegaard, I think, talks about that the gospel must be offensive, right? Like his idea was, and I think it's called Christianity in Training, right? He wants to reintroduce Christianity to Christendom, right? And he wants to talk about the offense of the gospel. And that's similar to what Cohen is doing. Cohen wants to make the gospel offensive again. You would never kill an American Christ in the way it's constructed. But the Black Christ is threatening. So the very religious aesthetic of Christianity has to be changed to make it offensive once again. And that's part of the project of James Cone.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really helpful. There are two questions about some of the language he uses around the incarnation and the cross, and thinking about the Christology in contemporary context. One, Jennifer asks, what does it mean to say that God's incarnation is, quote, not random, but deliberate identification with the oppressed? And then another one, Nicole asks, how does connecting the cross to the lynching tree transform our understanding of both symbols?
Yeah, well, the first one, when I say not random, I'm meaning that the whole, when you do your Christmas story, you talk about being the baby Jesus born in the manger, and it's all like sanitized and sweet and sentimental and that type of thing, that Black theologians, and I think it in company with liberationists, say, no, that's not just some type of story of cuteness. That's actually talking about God, how God bounds God's self, right, to certain types of human circumstances, right? Like that's actually a revelatory act. If you could choose to be reborn in any human life throughout history, most of us would choose to be reborn into a life that had more privilege, more comfort, more money, maybe better looking, whatever. We wouldn't choose to go downward. We would choose upward. But the fact that God chose to actually incarnate into a rejected, into an impoverished, into institutionalized violence, into someone who had to flee their own countries and become a migrant and a refugee, right? That is as revelatory as the birth itself, right? So that's where the idea of solidarity with the oppressed is, in terms of God's solidarity, that is at the center of the Christian tradition, the interpretive center of the tradition. It's saying that these things are not accidental, they're chose deliberately and intentionally. And if you just focus on the soul of Jesus, or the spirituality of Jesus, and not the in-flesh humanity of Jesus, in terms of the sociological and cultural location, you're missing the boat, right? That is the revelation right there. And that should be used to reread the entire biblical worldview.
And so how does that kind of play out just in the kind of mutual transformation of both like the cross and the lynching tree when they're connected symbolically?
Yeah, they should be read in light of each other. The starting point becomes is that the cross has lost much of its theological meaning, right? Like it's danger, right? Like it's a Roman execution, right? That we're actually celebrating. And most people see it as like a type of adornment, or something be tatted on your thigh, or as a cross or a necklace. And there's nothing wrong intrinsically with that. But when you see it, it becomes so common into people who have into places that don't really carry any type of theological or religious significance. It becomes it's like a Santa Clausification of the birth of Christ. So for him, what he wants to do is he wants to restore the offense, the terror of the cross, right? And part of doing that is to say, for North American Christians, the closest we could get to how horrible this experience is the lynching tree. And he goes back into the Black experience and recovers this symbol of lynching and how common it was at a certain historical period, and says, if we see the cross in light of the lynching tree, we could unlock the meaning of the cross for North American Christians again, right? And then we could also see not just the historical lynchings, but contemporary lynchings that are happening, such as the lynching of a George Floyd, right? He's talking and the lynchings of other type of Black men in prison systems, the lynchings of all types of institutional violences that are happening. So he wants to come back and talk about what does it mean to be a crucified people, right? And that if a beaten and rejected body is at the center of your faith, right? Why can't you see beaten and rejected bodies that are present in your everyday experiences and not make that connection? And that's his major point.
Yeah. Yeah. James asked, what does it mean? Oh, wait. This is the next one, I think. This one makes more sense here. Okay. What Daniel asked, what does Cone mean when he discusses the politics of Jesus' resurrection, and how does it relate to the struggle for freedom and justice in the present?
Yeah, that must be from
God of the Oppressed.
Oppressed.
Yep.
God of the Oppressed, right? The politics of Jesus' resurrection. You know, I can't remember exactly what he talks about the politics of Jesus' resurrection. Is he talking about the historical politics or the contemporary politics?
The way I read it is that the affirmation of the resurrection, it helps orients ourselves in the present to the relationship of materiality, power, and all those dynamics. In the same way, the resurrection orients us towards those that deal power and build crosses in Jesus' own context. And so the politics of the resurrection is both revelatory of the side God is on, and it's orienting towards what fidelity as the body of Christ looks like. If that's what fidelity looks like there, solidarity, these kinds of things, what does it look like in the present, that kind of stuff.
So to just to rephrase that, so you mean the execution, so the executioners of Jesus, right? If you get that right, kind of reveals who are the contemporary executioners of today, right? Like in terms of that. Yeah, I think that's part of like what's revealed, like the violence, like for him, the cross is not, he doesn't use the kind of atonement symbols of Abelard and Anselm. I mean, that might be a little bit too theologically opaque, but he doesn't want to talk about the cross as a metaphysical or an ontological thing, right? He wants to say what it reveals is the idea of violence. The politics of violence, let me say it in more simple terms. What it reveals is the violence that occurred 2,000 years ago, and that the crosses of the day reveal the same type of violence, and that part of our Christian walk is, to quote the Sermon on the Mount, is not just to be peace lovers, but peacemakers, right? Most people say they love peace, but they don't try to make peace. So there's a difference between a lover of peace and a maker of peace. And part of what's revealed in the cross is that we have to be makers of peace, not just lovers of peace.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the themes that kind of runs across Black theology is this dynamic of it is both the religion of the oppressor and the oppressed. And what do you do about it? And Michelle asked, how can Christianity be both a religion of the oppressed and a tool for oppression? What does this reveal about the veracity of the faith in its human members?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Black people have been asking the whole time. One of us got to be wrong here. But Christianity has been used. I mean, we're talking about institutional faith, right? Like it's been used for all types of, to justify both pro-slavery and anti-slavery, pro-woman and anti-women, pro-same-sex relations, anti-same-sex relations, right? Like it's been used to justify both. These are ideologically, contrasting or antithetical positions. So Christianity can be used for almost anything, right? The key thing is that theologians debate is what's authoritative about the faith, right? Like where is the center of authority, right? And we have to use metaphors to talk about that, right? So we're limited. So most people, the typical Christian will say, well, The greatest metaphor to talk about God for Christianity is love. Love is a metaphor to talk about how God is active in the world. In liberation theology, they claim the idea of love, but the most loving act to do to a person who's enslaved or in prison is to free them. So therefore, the metaphor becomes liberation, right? Liberation just means freedom. So you love people into freedom, right? So it's love, how love functions historically, because in the context of the United States, love has been so sloppily defined, right? And if you're talking about at the time of the birth of Black theology, love was always associated with forgiveness, with reconciliation, with nonviolence, and those became straitjackets, right, for Black people who were protesting, because you didn't have the same requirements for George Washington. You didn't have the same requirements for Thomas Jefferson, right? You don't say, well, they should love the British and they are fighting for the liberation struggles. You don't have that. Well, when marginalized groups do it, it all of a sudden becomes this type of restraining in terms of that. So part of liberation theology is to break out of that and to say that, yeah, love is a center, but the way love is expressed historically is through liberation. And that becomes the motif and the metaphor for how Black folks have understand their Christian project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the questions we got that were related to both Thurman and Cone comes from Timothy, who asks, what specific critiques does Cone Thurman make about the historical practice of Christian missionary work? Is there a liberative form of missions or evangelism? And in the longer email, the questions in, he was talking about how the moment you switch from the religion of Jesus to religion about Jesus, so much of kind of missionary work just becomes like a Jesus stamp on colonialism.
Yeah. That's actually a good question. There is some talk about that. You know, I know some liberation theologians talk about how the poor evangelized them. They didn't just evangelize the poor, right? So in terms of that. So most of the time when they talk about evangelism, it's much more dialogical than it is like a monologue, where if you talk to most, Christian evangelicals in North America, like when they talk about evangelism, is them with the word of truth who go to the natives and want to kind of impose. But for Cone and others, it's much more of a dialogue and a sharing of one's humanity in terms of that. And it's much more invitational than top down, like in terms of that. So liberationists in general are attentive to the dynamics of power in that, so that it becomes an invitation or a journey to actually people to participate in, and not as a way to kind of escape one's culture or to escape a hell that's going to inevitably happen if you don't listen to me and affirm my truth.
Yeah. I think that's helpful. One of the other comparison points, connection points between Thurman and Cone came from Karen, who has said both Thurman and Cone critique Christian approaches that intellectualize the faith or remove it from earthly suffering. How do their critiques of this tendency overlap, different, collaborate, that kind of thing?
Oh, they critiqued. Yeah, that's an interesting. I'll take Cone more so because he was much more direct about this particular point. When Cone started writing, he wrote in '68. By the 1980s, when he's like maybe 12 years in, you had the rise of like feminist and womanist theology, who had a strong critique of atonement, traditional ideas of atonement, and the cross. So much so that his colleague Dolores Williams said, "We don't need to solve the cross is about some suffering guy on a bloody guy on a stick. Like, we don't need that as part of our faith. So they focused on the teachings and the ministry of Jesus and not on the cross. And they critique Cone's work for being too Christocentric and for privileging the cross. And Cone really listened to them, but he eventually sided with, because one of his last books is The Cross and Lynching Tree, sided with the cross in terms of being central to his theological formation, because whenever he looked globally around the world, there's something about the cross that was meaningful to marginalized communities. It was something about God identifying with you in your deepest pain, right? So for him, the cross was a way to try to get beyond the intellectual and into the suffering. Quick story. I was actually a teaching assistant for Cone during 9/11. We were in New York. As some people may know, Union Theological Seminary is in New York City, right? So during 9/11, when the plane started to hit, we were actually in class, and you see people like panicking because they have children and loved ones, and they're like, what should we do? And no one could really interpret what the moment. At the time, we had no idea. It was a bad type of, we didn't know it was an accident. I don't think we understood it as an attack, but what we knew was that a plane had hit and something really bad had happened. So I remember Cone talking to the class really quickly, and he said, well, we could cancel class, but some of the best theology is done in pain. It's done in suffering. And he started talking about, I'm willing to stay here and help us figure it out. And, all the theology students will say, we appreciate your sentiment, Dr. Cone, but we got to get the hell out of here. But for Cone, I raised that story because for Cone, he always thought pain was the starting point for good theology, that good theology begins in pain and wrestles with suffering in a real honest and heartfelt way. And that was a conviction he really lived out. And I think it really, it's autobiographical for him, because he was in pain when he started to write his theological text. And part of his therapy was coming to clarity about what's happening, because he thought he really ruined his life. He said, I have all this theology in my head, and I don't know, it doesn't make sense of the world as I experience it. And for him, for writing those texts was a way of trying to come to clarity. He says, I didn't even think I'd change anything. I was just trying to come to clarity for me and leave a witness to that. Because I'm not even sure if anybody's going to listen to what I have to say, right? So I say that to give a window into how he was able to kind of not get caught up in the intellectual games. Even though he was across from Columbia University for all his career, for most of his career, for 50 years, he never got into the theoretical game. He was, Columbia had, Noam Chomsky, Edward Said, the greatest intellectuals on the left that ever would come through New York City and Columbia University specifically. And he was really never interested and fascinated by it. He would scoff at the lust for theory. And most of his students were, they wanted to prove their smartness by going to all these type of things. But Cone was never himself interested in that. For him, he was much more interested in exploring. And this is actually kind of similar about him and Howard Thurman. Thurman had a chance to get a PhD too, and he said, I'm not doing all that type of thing. He says, I'm interested in trying to articulate the way God prompts me in my own spirit, in my own head. And they were much more trying to work out the grain in their own wood than to try to follow the intellectual currents of their day.
Yeah. At the beginning of the lecture, you said it in context of the larger challenge of the church in general in America to Christian nationalism. And there are two questions related to that. One's more specific and one's more just amusing. the framing of it. Laura asked, how could Black Christology inform resistance to contemporary forms of Christian nationalism? And Noreen asked, is it fair to see white American evangelicalism in its support of Trump and co. as slaveholder religion part 2, heresy, another religion? And she offered some other categories that were not fit for it sounded like Luther getting angry about
Oh
indulgences on the
God.
Pope. But
Oh God.
I think they come from a similar place.
Wow. Wow. Um, Black Christology kind of counters contemporary Christian nationalism by centering Christ with the oppressed, right? And exposing its co-optation as anti-gospel, right? And the idea of kind of centering with the oppressed, like, gives a certain type of prophetic witness, aligning faith with justice movements and not with imperial power. Um, so, and I think this is where the idea of the religious aesthetic of the Black Christ like comes in, right? Like, it's not just this type of Christ as a liberationist, although it is that, but the image, like, if could you imagine, like, if every white church changed its religious imagery to not just a Black, but even a historically accurate version of Christ, right? Like, in terms of that, and how they might look at immigrants differently, how they might look at refugees differently, right? If your God image was more in the image of something that's outside of you, right? So I think even aesthetically and the visual art of the church or the iconography of the church, if it was transformed, that you might get a kind of a different type of neighborly love that will come out of predominantly white churches, right? In terms of that, so I think that's first in terms of that. It's the idea of centering both aesthetically and intellectually into the communities of the oppressed, right? Like, is the way to kind of counters Christian nationalism. And I forgot the second question.
Oh, it's really going when you like. How do you see from if what's normative? If you make normative kind of a Black theological tradition, what do you even make of white American evangelicalism and support of Trump, all that kind of stuff? Is it like the contemporary expression of slaveholder religion? Should you call it a heresy? Should we just say it's another religion altogether? And in Noreen's larger email, she said, she grew up conservative evangelical, and basically when relating to ethnic based churches in scare quotes, that kind of thing, it was like, well, do they still ask Jesus in their heart? Well, then it's okay, right? So they had a norm, and it was, do they have a personal relationship with Jesus? And then you would still count as a Christian even if you had bad politics or whatever. And she's like, but if we take seriously God taking sides, if we take seriously crossing the lynching tree and these kind of things, should we, on behalf of the gospel, draw distinctions that we're uncomfortable making as more progressive people?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, here's one way to think about that. One way of thinking about what Cohn is trying to fight against, when he says whiteness, he's not talking about white people per se. He's talking about whiteness as an ontological category, meaning, what does it mean to be acceptably human, right? Like, whiteness becomes not just a way of racializing, but a way of trying to symbolize what becomes acceptably human, not just for white people, but for Black and all other types of people. So therefore, the people that are seen as most acceptable are the people who speak, who go to white institutions, who speak more like white folks, who who go to the same type of institutions, who have the same credentials, and they become more human, right? So for him, the idea of, like, even having a Black Christ, so for him, that criteria is heretical, right? Like, in terms of that, because it flattens and marginalizes God's freedom and God's diversity, right? Like within it. And that the idea of trying to have these standards about there are some people who are acceptable and some people who are disposable, right? These type of categories. And you can see that in the way we treat folks. I mean, we see that with the Palestinian conflicts. We see that with what's happening in Sudan and the Congo. And the fact that we have so many disposable people is part of the project of this type of what he would call as a white Christ in terms of that. So for him, it's a heresy. It's a theological heresy. It's not just a politics. It's not just a cultural formation. It's a heresy that doesn't allow us to see the fullness of God in clear and present ways. And this is what he's trying to fight against, and he's trying to offer a way of correcting it in the context of North America.
There are a couple questions about the Black theological tradition and its place in church life. Brenda had a long email and had a number of questions in it, so I just pulled them out. She asked, how many Black churches in the U.S. are currently actively teaching and practicing Black theology? And then she was like, I'm not sure what that meant, but if you get what I'm asking. Who are the current prominent Black theologians? What practices are being advocated by current Black liberationist churches and pastors? And she also was asking about the relationship of the academy and the church in Black church life, this kind of thing. She said she's an old mainline Protestant person who was just invigorated reading it.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, Black churches are primarily atonement communities, like most Christian churches. And what I mean by that is that most of them will see the criteria for entry is accepting Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, right? Like in your heart, right? So most Black churches are very much influenced by white evangelical theology. So they are much more of that than you do have people who actually are trained in Black liberation theology, especially now with the rise of the mega churches and the prosperity gospel and the televangelism and even the type of streaming churches now, the type of ecosystem of churches now. So you have much more of that than you do of kind of Black liberation theology here in churches. So you're not going to see like a real practice. You might have certain types of outstanding examples of that throughout the country in certain urban areas, but not a whole lot. Like, and there's several reasons for that. One being that there's not that many Black seminarians, right? There's not that many Black people who actually go to Black people are, well, first, let me just say, Black people are only 13% of the country, right? That's one. Secondly, of that 13%, there's a tiny handful that go into first, there's a tiny handful that go to college, period. Then after college, to go to graduate school, then to go to a theological grad school where you are probably not going to make a whole lot of money, right? In terms of practical things. So it's a very, very small, infinitesimal amount of people that actually do get trained in liberation theology. That's one to kind of to say that. And it does have to be a certain type of training, because in order to understand Black liberation theology, you have to kind of decolonize or come out the programming of your own type of upbringing, because it's not always obvious, right? You don't come up in that type of teachings, or most people don't, right? So that's one. But there should be better connections. And when you see Black liberation theology or people be more interested in it, it's usually as a response to a Black social movement, such as Black Lives Matter, right? Like you saw many Black theologians or many Black churches and even white churches become more open to Black liberation theology as a consequence to social justice movement. And we could probably see with the kind of current administration and the kind of racial injustice that's been happening, like kind of at micro levels, at local levels, how it's setting up for about a year and a half from now to have a national kind of similar to Black Lives Matter movement that will kind of centralize racial justice, where I think Black theology will emerge again to the top of the national agenda, where people are looking at race not just as a political or a social issue, but as a theological issue, and how we can actually talk about life together in new and creative ways.
Yeah. Yeah. One last thing, this showed up in a number of different questions, and I don't think anyone knew the connection between you and Cone and Raphael Warnock. But there were questions about the you know, they heard they someone even said my minister, and then this is a much more conservative white congregation, was like, I can't believe he's really a minister. And then I was like, oh, that's funny because he has a PhD in theology. Um, but you mentioned, kind of like the election setting up a time where like the Moral Monday movement, the Poor People's Campaign, and these kind of things where there's the organizing and the church and kind of the prophetic voices from the academy that play a role in the church, all kind of showing up again in the public square. And so when you think of the public role of theology that different leaders in Black theology have played, from like all the way, following the even the story in the lecture from Thurman to Cleage to Cone into the present. What do you think the way the social questions show up in Black life in the present? How do they become theological questions? Someone else even mentioned they loved the way you had talked about previously on the podcast about what is it like to treat the Black Lives Matter movement as a site of theological reflection. And so knowing the emphasis each of these figures made of the particular context of America in their own moment and how it shaped their own things. How are you kind of exegeting the moment, even just mentioning like a year and a half out as a site of theological reflection?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Well, first, I would just say in general, all particularities are sites of theological reflection. I would just kind of say that just as a general principle. But in terms of race being theological, well, there are a couple ways to understand it. I think probably the most relatable way is to say that one of the most heretical thing that racism does, it doesn't allow us to see the imago Dei in the other, right? Right. And that's probably, so here we're talking about immanence, or kind of horizontal in terms of that. That racism, Rabbi Abraham Heschel talks about racism is Satanism, right? And that's what he's trying, or he talks about it as an eye disease. Racism is an eye disease, where you're so focused on the type of visual externals that you're unable to see each human being as a spark of God, a spark of the divine in that way. And it kind of blocks us off from that. So it limits our capacity to relate meaningfully to the other, which is a cancellation of neighborly love in the Christian heritage, right? Like in terms of that. And I think that's probably the most relatable thing. You could also talk about how it doesn't help us that it's part of the heart of God's concern about creation in terms of that, but that might be more abstract to people. But I think at a more kind of very tactile level, it's like, what prevents us from seeing human beings as equal? And racism isn't the only type of thing, but it becomes a primary thing in the context of the American history, right? Like, how can you justify, like, even to take the idea of, I'm actually trying to think of something that's not inflammatory, it's super controversial type thing. What's been in my mind and my spirit really is about Palestine, right? Mm-hmm. Like, why are truth claims of Palestinian not weighed equally as truth claims of Israelis, right? Like in terms of that, like, why don't both communities have equal truth claims? How can you actually see people starving and just say, well, they did it to themselves, right? Like in those type of thing. And that's a certain that's not an anti-Black racism, but it's a form of racism because it's a form of type of talking about a categorization. But Black people feel that very deeply because that's what happened to us in terms of that we weren't allowed to actually do things that other communities were. And I guess you could say in terms of, most obviously it came at the idea of violence and nonviolence, right? Like a lot of liberationists broke from the mandatory nonviolence of Martin Luther King over that issue because they were saying that white evangelicals, right, they don't bound themselves to the ethic of nonviolence, right? And they don't see that as part of their Christian restraint or Christian commitment, right? But they impose that on Black folks when they're fighting for their freedom, right? In terms of that. So it's like, why is it when it comes to us that somehow we're out of pocket for not being nonviolent, but you don't impose that on you and your leaders. Your leaders can protect the state violently, and the origins of country can be violent, and you can talk about fighting the British and being violent, but yet when Black folks try to talk about the same type of thing, right? And why is it when you bomb our communities, it isn't type of domestic terrorism, but when a foreigner comes and bombs your community, it's terrorism, and you go to war with them for years and years and years, and we don't get the same type of, and when it comes to our actually type of acts of justice and retribution, they are perceived differently as acts of hatred, not acts of self-defense, right? So it's more about that type of thing, of not seeing ourselves in a fully human context, or what we say is pathologizing Blackness and not seeing us in a fully human context. And that's been probably the way of trying to not see as a theological significance. It's about what it means to be acceptably human and to understand things in human responses. It's unfair if in college, if someone has a drug problem, it's a medical issue. But if someone in the Black community has a drug problem, it's a criminal justice issue, right?
Mhm.
Same thing, just treated very differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I've really appreciated you getting to respond to a bunch of very excellent questions from all the members of the class, which if you're enjoying the Q&A and haven't watched the lecture and aren't a member, manyfacesofchrist.com, join up and you can get it. And very excited that you'll be back at Theology Beer Camp this year. And now this is Kelly Brown Douglas first time, and you were
Yeah.
you were on the you should really get her to come to camp question. So maybe you want to say a little bit about her, and for for people to feel the lure to come hang out with us in
Oh,
Minneapolis.
yeah. Well, she's a brilliant theologian, and she's actually a good question to ask that in terms of the relationship between Black theology and Black churches, because she's a actually ordained minister who's in a Black church and a trained top Black theologian. And she's one of the people who does it very, very well. She's mostly located in the academy and not the church, but she has a connection and a dialogue with the church. But she's probably the best person to ask that question. But she's not just a Black theologian, she's a womanist theologian. So she embodies both kind of the womanist theological and the Black theological heritage, where she's not just a Black womanist theologian, she's one of the pioneering, like one of the first class of womanist theologians who was there at the birth of that, and was not just a critic, but an observer of its emergence. It was able to kind of talk about, I remember her, I think I was listening to it on your podcast, where she said, when womanist theology started coming up, I was like, why do we need another theology called womanism? And then when she said, when the brothers weren't let us in the church, then I was like, oh yeah, we need a womanist theology here. They tripping. Right? So her, just as she's a really a very essential historical figure to the whole emergence of Black and womanist theology. And I think it will be a treat for those who are interested, and for even people who are not necessarily interested. She's a very charismatic and compelling speaker, and I think it would be worth your while to get to beer camp to hear her talk.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Adam. And it's always good to get to talk to you. I wonder how many times we've done this. But you know,
it's been a lot. Yeah.
you're one day they're going to be so hard up for dissertation ideas. They're just going to make one of will we have 500 hours of Tripp and Adam talking?
Right, yeah. That's right. Well, you were way more disciplined this time. Like you just were like really focused. Like this is a little different.
I know. Well, it's would they listen to your lecture and read things you picked? So Tripp's thoughts about it. I was trying. Look, occasionally I decenter myself, Adam. Once, twice a month.
I didn't get any Laker talk here.
Oh. Well, yeah. Well, I didn't need to get depressed.
I didn't get any like Luka's gonna do it next year. I didn't get any of that.
Look, if people have wondered what happens if you put really good players on a team without a center in the playoffs, we now know. Oh, yeah.
So this is a different type of. This is a very disciplined homebrewed experience. Usually, it's brewed, right?
Yeah. Well, next week the questions are about my lecture, so I'll be able to talk plenty.
Gotcha.
And I want you to know, believe it or not, Adam, I could not get my lecture under 40 minutes.
Yeah. Well, you kind of wrote a book on it, so
I know. And I was like, well, I had these. I always try to do things a little different every time I do it to see if I come up with something. And I think I did. And then I watched it back the first time. I was like, oh, junk, that was 80 minutes. I'm going to do it again.
Oh, wow.
And I did it again. But
long.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I did that too. I mean, I did the same thing. What I want to show is a connection between Thurman to Cleage to Cone, their personal connection. So I'm working on a piece on that too. So hopefully that comes out sometime.
Awesome. All righty. Well, thank you all for listening. And